graduate of SOMAS and has had a very successful career, and also has recently retired, and is also a dear friend. And so it's my pleasure to turn it over to Kim.
Can you all hear me? Okay, great. I appreciate that Mike has given me the opportunity to just tell you a little bit about the highlights of my career and hopefully give you some tips for you, the next generation. And hopefully I don't bore you too much. And thank you, Greg, for helping to set up this talk, because I won't have to go into such details on many things because of Greg. Okay. So a lot of you, I'm sure, knew you wanted to get involved in the environment at a young age. Not so much for me. When I started out my career, I thought I wanted to be a nurse. So I ended up going to nursing school, and then I found out that really wasn't a good career choice. But I was still sort of interested in human research, so I got my undergraduate degree from Brook College. My first job was working for NYU Hospital, doing some assay work, and again, it just wasn't the career for me. And so I needed to figure out where to go. And I think I really looked at my long history living out on the North Fork and really enjoying the water and the marshes out there, and decided, let's try marine science. And I was concerned about the environment and seemed like a good career, so I had to remake myself. So I ended up going to grad school at what we call the Marine Science Research Center, which is now the School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. So I finished my master's. I worked on life history of sand lands. And my first job was working for a professor at Stony Brook in marine science, doing a trawl survey in the lower Hudson River. And that was really exciting. It was really fun to see all the species going from the north end of Haverstraw Bay down to Sandy Hook. It was a really exciting time. And we worked year-round, and that was sort of exciting in the winter. But there wasn't a lot of funding, and the funding was drying up, so I needed to look for another position. And a position opened up at the DEC in marine resources, so I took that. And that's where I ended up staying through my career. And you may think that that was sort of a static career, but during that time, I got involved in just a lot of different aspects of monitoring and research and management. And I also ended up working with just a number of species, which I like to coin as snails to whales. I don't really have time to talk, even give highlights on everything. So I'd like to focus and give you my experience seen through my work with striped bass, Atlantic sturgeon, lobster, and whelk. Greg sort of started striped bass history in the 1980s. Well, I wanted to give you an idea of what was going on when I started my job in 1985. So this graph up here, you can see that the stock was crashing starting in the early 70s and just continued. Landings just crashed into the late 80s. The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission developed the first management plan for striped bass in 1981. But at that time period, there weren't any rules that forced states to actually comply with the management plan. In 1984, the federal government came through with the Striped Bass Act, and that gave the same legislation that NOAA Fisheries could shut fisheries, any state's fisheries down if they didn't comply with the management plan. So it's a sort of a precursor to our FACMA that Jim mentioned. And in 1985, they developed management measures to protect the 1982 year class. And those measures included closed commercial fisheries in many states, and also the recreational fishery, the size limit went up to 38 inches. So this is what I walked into, the sort of blind new grad student. my first job was involved supervising monitoring programs for young of the year striped bass. One, let me get this, in the lower Hudson River. And, oops, wrong one. You can see this is a general area we were sampling. And another one looking at juveniles was in western Long Island, in Manhasset and Little Neck Bay on the North Shore, Jamaica Bay on the South Shore. And we set a 200-foot beach seine by boat and pulled it in by hand. And just as reference, this is a little young of the year and a 1-year-old in July. So it gives you just a size reference. And the reason we were doing this work is to try to track recruitment of young of the year bass to later life stages. I think because of my work involved with working in the Hudson River, both at the DEC and previously with Marine Sciences, my supervisor at the time, Byron Young, got me involved with a lot of work with the Hudson River power generation. So Greg had mentioned the Hudson River Biological Monitoring Program, which sampled the whole Hudson River, not just the lower Hudson. And I was involved with a lot of coordination and oversight with the monitoring program. But I also got involved with impact assessment, and I had very close collaborations with Andy Canley and Kathy Patella of Hudson River Fishery Unit, which again, Greg mentioned them. We worked on reviewing permit mitigation, and one important project was reviewing a draft environmental impact statement that was developed for permit renewal. And during that time period, I worked closely with Andy and Kathy. We collaborated with the utilities biologists and also some really high-powered population dynamicists who were contracted to do some of this work, such as Ray Hillborn and Carl Walters. So it was a very exciting time for me, and I really learned so much. And the collaborations were just great and really important for my career. Byron is also very generous, and he let me take his place on the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission Technical Committee. And through that, I got onto the sort of origin of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service coast-wide striped bass tagging program. And I got on a committee where we helped to develop some of the standards. We started tagging the striped bass in our Young of the Year survey, and this map over here, you can see some of the recaptures which range from Chesapeake Bay up into Canada. Again, I was very lucky. We had training, some of it through Dr. Dave Smith, who's currently at the U.S. Geological Survey. Also, ASMFC and USGS got together and brought in some really important people who did tagging models. And with mentorship from Dave, we were able to develop an age-structured tagging model. And the estimates of age-structured mortality continue to be used in the current striped bass stock assessment. So I want to just quick talk about some of the challenges and opportunities during my striped bass phase. Certainly a challenge, I got in as the stock was collapsing. On top of it, we had found out that many of the striped bass were contaminated with PCBs, but I don't really have time to talk about that. I also got my first flavor of dealing interactions with the fishing public, and of course they were not very happy that we were increasing management regulations at this time period. Also, challenge of technology, or lack thereof. When I started, we didn't even have a desktop computer. I had to do my work using pen and paper and a calculator. So that certainly was a bit of a challenge. We also use a lot of seasonal staff, and that's exciting because you give people first opportunity, first step in the door in marine science, but they find other opportunities and they leave for other jobs. So you have a lot of rollover. But there are great opportunities. I had a great supervisor with Byron Young. He was a real great mentor. He also had a lot of trust in me and allowed me to make changes in the field survey and helped me with just learning new things. Great field staff. We spent so much time in the field, we really became a good team. Even if we had a lot of rollover with seasonal laborers, it was good seeing new people coming through the door. We also had great collaboration. We worked very closely with students at SOMAS, particularly the Conover lab at that time period. And they would come out and help us out in the field, and we would provide samples and data. So it was a really good working situation. I was lucky. We had really good funding and had good training opportunities. And an opportunity, I think I was very influential in having our first computers bought at, in the Division of Marine Resources, especially for fisheries. So it was an exciting time. Okay. On to sturgeon. So a little background here. Byron needed somebody to help with sturgeon management and said, hey, somebody in the office going to volunteer? Well, my first job in the Hudson River, we used to catch a lot of sturgeon. And I thought they were really pretty cool fish. So I said, yeah, I'll volunteer. Well, at the time, this was early 1990s. You can look at this graph up here, table up here. Many states still had directed gillnet fisheries in the Hudson, and there was a lot of indirect harvest out in the Marine District. But several states had already closed their fisheries, particularly South Carolina. They closed it because there was a drastic drop in landing. So in 1990, ASMFC developed the first fishery management plan for Atlantic sturgeon. And the goal was to protect stocks from further depletion, improve knowledge of sturgeon, because there really was a lack of knowledge, and also to enhance and restore stocks. So one of the first things we needed to do was to develop some regulations to monitor and try to control the harvest. So I ended up having a really close collaboration with Andy Canley and Kathy Hatella, and we ended up building a population model for New York's sturgeon population, and we used that model to help with management. We started out putting on a minimum size limit and seasons and eventually a quota. We utilized the Hudson Biological Monitoring Fall Shoal Survey to sort of track what was going on in the population, because we didn't have any other monitoring program at the time. And the information showed this sort of decrease in abundance in the late 80s. And even with our management, we didn't see much of a response. So in 1996, New York ended up closing the sturgeon fishery. And in 1998, ASMFC closed the whole coast. One thing I wanted to bring out, during that time period, I had a lot of meetings with, again, angry fishing public. Of course, they were not very happy that we were not only putting on management, but we ended up closing the fishery. But one thing I also, the feedback from them is you have to think about what we're doing is really affecting their livelihoods. So we can't take that lightly. But the bottom line is, if there's no fish, there is no fishery. So our job is really a balancing act. But we need to remember that as we do our work. During discussions with ASMFC, when we closed the fishery, discussed it would be great to have some interactions with Canada, because we knew fish we tagged in the US were migrating up to Canada. And then in 2003, the American Fisheries Society was having their annual meeting up in Quebec. And I said, thought it'd be a great opportunity to have a symposium on sturgeon, so I put in an application. Lo and behold, Jean Monroe from Canada Department of Fisheries and Oceans had also done that. So we ended up combining the symposium. We had several different themes, but what I thought was really important is we set out some time to have discussions on commonalities that we were seeing within these themes. We were lucky to find funding that we ended up getting information from this symposium published. And one of the commonalities that came out to me was nearshore movements and aggregations of sturgeons globally. And I remember discussions with some of the fishermen as we were closing the fishery. They were saying, but we catch lots of these young sturgeon near shore off the South Shore. And here's a picture one of the fishermen gave me of a small sturgeon that he had caught off the South Shore of Long Island. As fate would have it, I happened to be asked if I wanted to be a member of this newly developed committee to work on U.S. Fish and Wildlife State Wildlife Grant. And I said, sure. And part of that was to develop an action plan for species of special concern. But we were also the people who decided how we would spend that grant money. And I was able to convince the committee to allocate some funds that we could work cooperatively with SOMAS to do an ocean trawl survey off the South Shore of Long Island, because at that point, there were no surveys in near-shore ocean waters off New York. So we really didn't know much about our fish populations. Through that survey, we actually found an aggregation area of sturgeon off the Rockaways. And this is one of our first large catches of sturgeon right off of a sand mining pit, which was very muddy. But we caught close to 30 sturgeon, and all the other catches are more like 1 or 2. Through this work, I got to be close collaborators with Mike Friggs and Keith Dunton. And we were able to find more funding. They had an idea that let's use some of this new technology. Let's use acoustic tags and receivers and get a better idea on the movements. And not much work had been, acoustic work had been done at this time, so this is pretty groundbreaking. And we ended up putting an array off the Rockaways and acoustic gates off the South Shore of Long Island. And information, we were able to track the movements, seasonal movements of sturgeon along the South Shore and into the Hudson and Connecticut through other people's receivers. And we're continuing to use that information when we evaluate permits, especially for cables and pipelines and dredging, to determine when should we have closed windows to protect sturgeon moving by. So this is really important information. And we've been able to continue to find funding and keep these acoustic gates out. And it's been wonderful. Mike and his lab have increased the number of species that they're tagging. So we're finding great movement information. And we also have some mortality estimates through this tagging. So just a quick overview. A lot of the same challenges and opportunities between striped bass and sturgeon. Now, while I was working on sturgeon and I was still involved with this symposium, an opportunity came up that I could actually run a new unit. So I ended up getting a new position running the crustacean unit, and at this point, 2003, I was walking in, and in 1999, there was a huge die-off of lobster in Long Island Sound, and you can see the picture here. A lot of dead lobsters and crabs that came up in lobster traps. The Department of Commerce declared it a federal fishery disaster, and they provided disaster relief funds. Part of it went for economic relief, but others went for research and monitoring. And we used some of this fund to do a trap survey in western Long Island Sound. And here's just a picture of the crew tending the traps, and a little shout out to Rachel Sizak, who's now in charge of our Finfish unit. This monitoring survey ran from 2003 to 2009, but unfortunately the funding ran out. And I found it's not as easy to find funding for a commercially harvested species as it is for a species of concern. Through my work with lobster, I became very involved with the Atlantic States Marine Commission lobster assessments, and I was a chair or ran the model for many of these assessments. One of the things we found out determined through the assessments and also through research done to determine the cause of the die-off is that warming water temperatures were very critical and probably a key part of this lobster decline. And this graph here just shows temperature anomalies from the Millstone nuclear power plant in eastern Long Island Sound. And you can see early in the time series that water temperatures were generally cooler than average, but starting in 1998, water temperatures were much warmer than average the time we saw the decline. Another thing is that during this time period, our assessments, we kept seeing the population getting lower and lower, but very little management was done at the time when this population was declining. And this is just a graph from our latest stock assessments, which shows the continued decline of the stock, and this red line is the threshold. We want the population up here, and it's really in poor shape at this point. But again, I learned so much. A lot of the same challenges, though in particular climate change was a more important challenge for lobster than the other fisheries. Our interactions with industries, the little management that we did do, there was a lot of pushback. But again, a great field team, really close collaborations with people up and down the coast. With both sturgeon and lobster, I relied very heavily on collaborations and help from our regulatory group, both from the division and our legal counsel up in Albany. And it was great to just learn so much about assessments, and unfortunately I had to learn a lot about running lobster management meetings, which maybe that wasn't the highlight, but. And last but not least, I want to talk about whelks. Now, to just set the stage, the lobster population is declining. At the same time, the price for whelk is increasing in the market. And a lot of the lobstermen were switching from fishing on lobsters to whelk because they get caught in traps also. And in 2000 was the first time DEC actually required a commercial permit for whelk. Otherwise, we had no regulations. And in 2011, one of the whelk fishermen came to me and said he was very concerned. There was too much harvest on immature females. He was seeing the population, at least in his fishing area, going down. And he said, please, we got to put a size limit. And he and several other fishermen provided me with samples. We got samples from Connecticut Department of Energy and Environment. But first I had to convince my supervisor to let me take on another species. That took a while, but I finally did, and we did a lot of research determining the size of maturity, and here's a picture of, again, my great staff who we had to learn everything about whelk. We didn't know anything going in. So it was quite a learning experience, and from our research we determined that whelk don't even start becoming mature until 5.5 inches. So I started a regulatory process in 2013. By 2018, I was finally able to get in mandatory reporting, so whelk fishermen didn't even have to tell us what they were catching. So finally in 2018, they had to. It took until last spring to finally get a minimum size limit through, because we just had a lot of pushback from industry that they didn't want to see any sizes put in place, because they felt whelk was a predator on shellfish, that we should just kill them all, and they didn't want to see us protecting them. And again, a lot of the same challenges I saw with all the other species I worked with. And I'd like to leave you with just some thoughts over my long career. Don't be afraid of change, and question how things are being done. Sometimes things could be done better. I made a lot of changes in our survey when I started. We were questioning things in lobster and bringing in climate. We ended up changing natural mortality because we thought it had increased. And just the excitement and great data that we got collecting information with acoustic tags, working with Mike and others at Selmas. The importance of incorporating new technologies. When I came in, there was pushback about computers. Some of the older people in the department didn't think, they thought they were newfangled. So, and some of the new equipment you're using right now, in a decade it's going to be old. So, keep your eyes open. What's the new thing coming down, and is it worthwhile, and is it going to make the work you do better or easier to do? Collaborations work well, and they can come from surprising places. So I couldn't have done anything that I did without collaborations both internally, up and down the coast, but even collaborations with fishermen. Hearing about small sturgeon, nearshore environment, and also having a whelk fisherman come to me and tell me, we need to put regulations in. Don't be afraid to think outside the box for funding sources. A lot of this work couldn't have been done if I just didn't look around and say, how are we going to fund this work? Importance of listening and trying to work with people. Sometimes it's very difficult, but I think listening often is better than talking. And even listening to fishermen who are yelling at you, because, look at their perspective, but sometimes you can get some good information. The most important is we need to protect our marine resources, and don't give up. If it's important to do, you got to keep pushing at it. It took a decade to get the minimum size limit in for whelk, but I'm really proud that we finally got it in place, and I'm hopeful that this protection will reap benefits for the whelk population. Thank you very much for your attention.